Hello everyone, welcome to Simple Solutions. My name is Karam and today we will be talking about Park Studies History Section 2. Now, last time we talked about the partition of Bengal, which is the first topic in Section 2, but on special viewer request, we will be covering the 1935 Government of India Act. One of I got a comment on one of my YouTube video on one of my videos asking for me to cover the era from 1935 to 47, and I do understand that it is one of the it's the most complex part of section 2, so I'm gonna be covering that. So we're gonna be starting off with the Government of India Act of 1935. All right, first of all, what was the Government of India Act of 1935? So basically, after the roundtable conferences, which we all know failed, like none of the conferences worked and no results were produced, the British still decided that they would introduce a series of constitutional reforms, which then became known as the Government of India Act of 1935. All right, so according to this act, a federal form of government was introduced, which means central government was introduced with two houses, the upper house and the lower house. All right, the hierarchy was also dropped at the provincial level and introduced at the federal or central level, and provinces were given a large degree of autonomy, and NWFP, Sindh and Orissa were made into separate provinces, and the legislature for voting was extended to 25%. 25%. I just write that 25%. All right. That means about 35 million people could vote now in India. Obviously, these are summarized. If you want to check these out in detail, you can read them from the book or whatever. But I'm just summarizing them for you here because you really don't need to know the details of each and every one of these points. The important ones we'll discuss in detail uh, just later soon. We'll discuss them. All right. So you get two questions regarding the India Act from what I've seen and experienced. And the first one out of these two is about the importance of the Government of India Act. Why was the Government of India Act of 1935 so important to the future of the subcontinent? It's mostly a 7 mark question, and why I'm focusing on this so much is that because people often just glance over this act and children tend to forget it. Even in my school, personally, when we had our mocks, I remember we got a question, a 7 mark question on this act, and no kid in my class could remember it properly, and they got bad grades in it, including me. So I'm stressing this that you should remember this act. It is just as important as all the others, the Minto Morley reforms, the Montague Chelmsford reforms, and all other reforms. So please remember this act. It's quite important. All right, so its importance was that, first of all, provinces were granted some autonomy. All right, they were granted greater autonomy, which meant that they could devise and carry out their own plans and strategies and be responsible for to their own legislation, which was an important step moving forward. So the first part of the importance was that the provinces were granted autonomy. ठीक है ना? After that, the second point would be the ministers of provinces were given provincial autonomy and had control over departments. All right, so each province was managed by first a minister and then a governor. Uh, According to the 1935 Act, the provincial ministers were given actually more power than the provincial governors and had control over all departments and could carry out their own programs, right? For the betterment of the province. However, the provincial governors had the power to dissolve or veto a bill if they so in the interest of the state. Okay, the provincial governors could even dissolve the National Assembly in a province, and this was seen as a drawback because the provincial governors were appointed by the British, so they were British, while the ministers were Indian representatives. So that is why this was seen as a drawback, but it is also important because like they had a lot of autonomy. After that, the last point would be that additional rights were given to the local population for voting, and the number of voters was extended by 5 times to a total of 35 million people. All right, 25% of India's population could now vote. So that was a pretty big thing. The provision There were also provision, as we have studied, the provisions for a federal government was also laid down, and the central level, which meant that princely states could also now take part in political affairs. All right, so these are the three reasons why it was important. The provinces were granted autonomy, more greater autonomy. The ministers had control over all departments and were given provincial autonomy, and additional rights were given to the local population for voting, and the number of voters was extended by 5 times to a total of 35 million people. Additional rights for voting, ministers were given more power, and provinces were given greater autonomy. These are the three reasons why they were appointed. You can, if you want, make notes of all 3 points, because these are all 3 points you need to know the importance. You don't even need to read this from the. If you want, you can for greater detail and knowledge, but this is enough, in my opinion. This is enough for you to get through a question if you get one about the 1935 Act, and it is going to be a 7 mark question, that I can assure you. After that, the second question would be, why was this opposed? Because the Congress opposed this act, the Muslim League opposed this act, everybody in the subcontinent opposed the 1935 Act. Why? Well, there were once again three reasons for this. I haven't written them down, but I'll tell you about them because you know, they're not that long. So the first reason was that even though we were introduced a federal form of government, and like the princes now had greater provincial autonomy, the viceroy and governor general the viceroy and the governor general were still the head of the federation. Like, they were still the head of the central government, and they could use their special powers if they wanted to, and for to veto bills, and just to veto bills and laws, in quote unquote the interest of the state. After this, the provincial governors also had special powers and had the right to dismiss ministers or the whole administration. So this was the first reason, greater power of viceroy and provincial governors. All right, they could veto any bill or law, and the provincial governors could dissolve the National Assembly, and also uh, there's yeah, they could dissolve or veto any law, which we have talked about already. So that was the first reason. After that, we have the second reason was that um, only 25%, like even though the votings were ledger for voting was extended, only 25% of India's population could actually vote because of the property qualification for voting. This means that only few people could vote, and all sides in India opposed it, from the princes to the Congress to the Muslim League. So there was little progress in gaining support. ठीक है ना? So we can say little or small amount of people could vote. People could vote. And finally, the last reason was that diarchy. As you saw above, diarchy was introduced at a provincial level, right? If I scroll up right here, you can see that even though it was dropped at the provincial level from the previous Montague Chelmsford reforms, it was still introduced at a central or federal level. So it was not completely abolished. It was just shifted from the provinces to the central government. So it could be misused anytime. If you know that, if you're not familiar with diarchy, you should read the Montague Chelmsford reforms. It's about reserved subjects and transferred subjects. So the reserved subjects still had much greater power compared to the transferred subject. So that was another reason that many parties and people opposed it, because it could be misused by the British at any time, and so the power for the given to the Indians was immediately reduced, right? So diarchy was not completely abolished. So that is another reason. And that is basically it. That is what you need. All you need to know about the Government of India Act of 1935. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I will make sure that I answer them to the best of my ability. Also, if you did not understand some of the points, you can ask about them to me, about them in the comments as well, and I will explain them to you in greater detail. Be sure to subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it, if found it helpful. And so, yeah, before ending it, we'll just go through a quick rundown, a quick revision. Right, Government of India Act, federal form of government, two houses, upper house and lower house. Diarchy was abolished at provincial level, but not at central level. Provinces were given a large degree of autonomy. NWFP, Sindh, and Orissa were made into separate provinces, and more people, and now 25% of people could vote. The voting ledger was extended. The importance of this was that it granted more autonomy to the provinces, and so they could devise their own plans and strategies and carry out their own programs. The ministers were also given provincial autonomy and had control over all the departments. However, the provincial governments could intervene and dissolve or veto a bill, or even dissolve the assembly, which was a drawback. And lastly, it was important because additional rights were given to the local population for voting. ठीक है ठीक है ना by it was about came to a total of 35 million people. And lastly, the reasons for opposition were that the viceroy and provincial governors still had greater power. They could veto or dissolve any bills, and the provincial governors could actually dissolve the entire assembly. uh, and so they had more power over the ministers, and they were appointed by the British.